self-governance. And we realized that in the face of corporate dictatorship and raping and pillaging of our communities, which is spreading across not only New Mexico from east to west and north to south, but across the country and across the globe, around the globe, we realized that we need to build a statewide network to follow in the footsteps of the work of our example by the city of Las Vegas, that passed the first community rights ordinance in New Mexico, which actually was the first west of Ohio. And what they did was they banned the oil companies and hydrocarbons extraction. But what they did most relevantly is they asserted their rights to democracy on the local level. They asserted their rights to determine their sustainable, renewable energy future. They asserted their rights to their health and their access to water. They asserted their rights to their birthrights. And they led the way to the development then of the New Mexico Coalition for Community Rights, because we saw that the movement that happened in the city of Las Vegas was going to happen across New Mexico. And so we created a holding place for other communities to come on board. And while the actions by the City Council were actions in solidarity with movement that was going on in Mora County, we found that their movement led us in Mora County to pass the first countywide community rights ordinance. And that was to ban oil and gas extraction and hydrocarbons, and again, to assert our rights. And so we have Commissioner John Olivas, who is the chair of the Mora County. John is the sponsor of that community rights ordinance. So we have a lot to celebrate, because we have seen communities across the country inspired by the work of the Commission in Mora County. So the relevancy of the talk this evening is about how do we reclaim, or how do we assert, maybe that's a better word, how do we assert our right to democracy on the local level? And do we have democracy? So we have to examine that very question. Do we have democracy? If we do we have a seat at the table? Do we have a voice about what happens in our community? If we don't have a voice, then if we don't take time today, we might just find that we won't even be able to get a peep out. So it's time today that we look at what our options are. And this evening we have Thomas Linzey with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund here to speak to us about how we can move more communities across the state of New Mexico to join in with over 160 other communities who have passed community rights ordinances. And these ordinances are about a Bill of Rights that protect our birthrights. And they are what will bring forward our rights to democracy. But it's a messy process, democracy. And it's very time-consuming. So it means that on a daily basis, we have to be willing to participate. And if we don't, we know that that void will be taken over by the corporate industry that is working 24/7 and is doing a really good job. So now we get to see what kind of good job we can do by rallying everybody together. So I'd like to introduce Thomas Linzey. And Thomas Linzey is the Executive Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. He was a co-founder of CELDF and has been working tirelessly, I would say, since the mid-1997, as I recall. And communities call CELDF up and say, we're up against the wall. We are currently facing a corporate threat, and the system of law is not protecting us. In fact, we are being fracked, or the factory farms are here, and businesses are small local businesses are going out of business. Our water is being depleted, or it's being contaminated, or the air is so toxic that the asthma rates are sky high. What can we do? And so that's what CELDEF is about coming in, helping communities organize, helping them strategize, and offering free legal assistance to those communities who bring forward community rights ordinances. So, without further ado, Thomas Linzey.
I'm hoping this thing is working. Can folks hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, pretty good term for acoustics. Thank you, Kathleen, for your endless energy. The New Mexico work is only happening because of Kathleen and her endless traveling around the state and basically just seemingly endless energy. And Commissioner Olivas, it's always a pleasure to come to New Mexico because I get time to spend with John, but Mora County and the amazing stuff that's happened in Mora County would not have happened without John. And so. Kathleen said tirelessly working or something to describe me. I can say over the last month or so, I've been quite tired because we had a trip to Australia and New Zealand. And the trip to Australia and New Zealand, which lasted about a month, we were on the road. Anymore with these long road trips, you measure them in terms of the number of laundry load trips that you need to do while you're on the road. This was a 6 laundry load trip to Australia and New Zealand. And the reason why we were called into Australia and New Zealand was to meet with folks who were facing off with fracking corporations in Australia. Australia has a huge amount of recoverable natural gas, these tight formations in Australia. And when you look at a map of Australia, it is almost all red now, with dots denoting fracking sites, permitted sites, and sites that are going through the permitting process. They are looking at a gas revolution that's going to scar their landscape for decades and generations to come. And so, imagine my surprise when we get a call from the Australian folks who are working on some things, and they have a copy of the Mora County Ordinance that they're sending to us. They said, "Hey, have you heard about this?" They got Mora County Ordinance in there. Well, let me tell you a story about how and so we spent time in Sydney and Melbourne and Perth in Australia. Suffice it to say, we thought we were pretty radical. You have Mora County passing this ordinance not only bans all hydrocarbon extraction within the county, which is huge, but also strips resource extraction, gas extraction corporations from having certain constitutional rights and powers within the county of Mora. What's that all about? And recognizes ecosystems as having rights in Mora. What's that all about, kind of thing. We thought we were being radical. But in Australia, they now have a movement that's arisen called Lock the Gate, which is property owners in different areas where fracking is intended to come, is targeting those areas, where the farmers and ranchers are now locking their gates, they're padlocking their gates, and then they're blockading the fracking trucks as they're coming into those areas. And so that level of civil disobedience we haven't seen yet, except in some indigenous communities now in Canada. But I think it's where we're headed. But that's what's happening in Australia now. They're targeted by the same actors, the same stuff's going on, and they're faced with a structure of law and government, just like in the United States, that actually allows it to occur. In fact, it accelerates and enables it to occur. And so all that stuff, was running through our brains as we were going through the Australia and New Zealand trip. Anyway, we didn't start, by getting on planes, and it's a long trip, so don't do it. It's like 15 hours or something. Getting on planes to go to Australia, New Zealand, stopped in Hawaii to work with some folks dealing with genetically modified seeds, about banning them on the islands of Kauai and the Big Island of Pleasure. And we didn't start there. We actually started much more simply, which was as a law firm back in 1995. We launched the law firm, which is known as the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and we launched it, created it to do something pretty simple, back then pretty simple, which was to help neighborhood-based, community-based environmental organizations to stop things like toxic waste incinerators, or sewage sludge, or factory hog farms, or any of the hundreds of different single issues that communities across the United States face off against each and every day. And the reason why we launched the Legal Defense Fund to provide free legal services to those groups is because legal service is very hard to come by. When you're a small neighborhood group, you're coming together around a kitchen table to decide to try to do something within a community, try to stop something that's happening within the community. Legal fees today, some of my peers within the environmental legal community charge $1,200 an hour just to review an ordinance or to comment on a permit. Or to do, I mean, they're regularly asking for $20,000 retainers just to actually be retained by groups. And so it's kind of nuts out there. And when we started in 95, the numbers were about the same as they are today, which is 200 full-time public interest environmental lawyers in the United States today, which sounds crazy, but that's the actual numbers. And so if you're a community organization and you need legal help, there's no place to turn, really, unless you're lucky enough to have a connection with, one of the few law firms that does public interest environmental law. And so we decided to launch because we decided that to add a couple more lawyers to that mix, because we framed the problem as not enough lawyers. In other words, in law school, you're taught that the United States has the best environmental laws in the world. And in fact, our laws are so good in the United States that we export them out to other places. And would you know, we've traveled to Ecuador and Nepal and Australia and New Zealand over the last 2 years. You actually run into them. The exported remnants of U.S. environmental laws you'll run into in these different countries. So if the problem is not the environmental laws themselves, then the problem must be there's just not enough people enforcing the laws. After all, why are things so bad? We asked ourselves as law students, so why are things so bad? And we came to the conclusion things were bad not because of the environmental laws, but because there just weren't enough people enforcing those laws, weren't enough lawyers. And so, when you hang out your shingle and it says free legal services, in an area where nobody's been able to obtain them for years and years and years, there's no surprise that, there's a line around the block and our phones started ringing off the hook back in 1995. And eventually we were representing over 300 different community organizations across the state of Pennsylvania. Folks dealing with factory farms and sludge, incinerators, you name it, all kinds of different things. And the way we began our representation of those community groups were initiated with a phone call. So the community organization would call us at our office. And they would say, we need help. We have a toxic waste incinerator that's been proposed for our community, and we don't want it. We want to be able to say no to it because we don't want it. And the learned lawyers on the other end of the line, us, would respond by saying, well, unfortunately, the U.S. system of law that we have in this country doesn't allow you to actually say no to the thing that's coming in, so a toxic waste incinerator or whatever. Because in the United States, because corporations have constitutional rights in the United States that allow them to sue your community if you actually attempt to blanket or in a straightforward sense actually ban a legal use. So just to cover that again, because it's always a complicated thing. But in the United States, municipalities are prohibited from banning legal uses. That's L-E-G-A-L. It's a nasty little secret of how the law operates. But municipalities are prohibited from banning legal uses. What's a legal use? Well, it's anything that has a permit that's been issued to it. That's deemed a legal use under the law. It's anything that hasn't been deemed to be a criminal activity or a nuisance of some sort. So what types of things have been deemed to be legal uses? Well, pork production has been deemed a legal use, so factory farms. Energy production has been deemed a legal use. Low-level radioactive waste disposal has been deemed to be a legal use. If you name it, most things have been deemed a legal use. And our municipalities are prohibited from saying no to a legal use. So just to break this down, because a lot of what we talk about sometimes in the abstract, let's talk about practical. Let's say the city of Santa Fe, the Santa Fe City Council says, hey, big box stores, we don't like them. They're bad for our local economy. They're bad for a number of reasons. We want to ban them. So they pass a one-paragraph ban ordinance that bans all big box stores from setting up shop within the city of Santa Fe. One-paragraph ordinance. What happens next is that Costco or Walmart, one of the other big box store corporations, sues the city of Santa Fe and says to the city of Santa Fe, you violated our constitutional rights because you've taken our property without compensating us, and there's a bunch of other claims that they can run against the city of Santa Fe. But in essence, not only can they sue to overturn the ordinance that's been passed, that one paragraph ordinance, but they can also sue the city of Santa Fe for damages. for future lost profits that the corporation has lost as a result of the passage of the one-paragraph ordinance. Sounds horrendous, sounds kind of stupid for a way a system should operate, but it's the law in the United States today, and it's been the law for the past 120 years in this country, that municipalities are prohibited from banning legal uses. So as the learned lawyers, we would relay this. We would share our knowledge, our glowing knowledge with the community organization that had called us. And we would say, well, you can't say no to it, because if you say no to it, it's been permitted by the state allows the use, you're going to buy a corporate lawsuit and all that kind of stuff, you'd be acting illegally. But what we can help you do is appeal the permit that's been issued to the corporation with the toxic waste incinerator. Thus began what I lovingly refer to as Groundhog Day. People may have seen the movie Groundhog Day. It's got Bill Murray in it. You know, Bill Murray lives the same day over and over and over again. It happens to be in my home state of Pennsylvania with the Punxsutawney Phil, and it's actually Groundhog Day. And he lives the same day over and over and over. Our day began when the community groups would contact us to actually say you want to stop something. We would give them the advice that you can't, but we can help you appeal the permit. And then we would go into this exhaustive, deep review that gives environmental lawyers such pleasure, which is to take the corporate permit application that's been submitted by the corporation, it could be 500, 1,000, 1,500 pages, whatever. And we would actually take it and compare it to the regulations that had been adopted to govern the issuance of that particular permit. And so we would sit in a dark room, and it's usually pretty lit, but we would sit in a room and we would compare the two, and we would try to find the gaps, omissions, and deficiencies within the permit application itself to argue that the permit never should have been issued because it didn't satisfy the requirements of the regulations that were in place. And so we'd spend long hours looking to find out whether a proper bond had been posted, you know, for a road. So toxic waste incinerators in Pennsylvania, you have to post a $500,000 bond to put them in because your trucks break up the roads. And so we would find permit applications with $200,000 bonds. The applications had to be signed by the president of the company. We would find applications that were signed by the secretary. They needed a macroinvertebrate water study. We'd find studies that were 30 years old. The corporations don't particularly care about putting their permits in order because 90% of all permits in the United States are not appealed. And they're not appealed because nobody has the money to appeal them, because most of these are communities that just don't have the resources to actually combat those permit issuances. And then we go in front of a judge, and we would say, Your Honor, under section little 2, little c, little d, little 2, little Roman numeral 2, little e, little I, little 2, little d, little 2, little Roman numeral 3, little e, little I, that the bond that was posted should have been $500,000, but they didn't post it. They posted a $200,000 bond. Therefore, Your Honor, we want you to toss the permit out that's been issued. And because most permits are never challenged, sometimes the battle is won just by showing up and actually being half coherent. That the judge would say, you're right on the law, the permit never should have been issued, I'm kicking the permit out, and thank you very much. And the next thing that would happen is that the community group would come over to us and invite us back to their house for a victory party. And we go back to the house of the community group, and we have some beer, and we have some wine, and we have some snacks, and everybody would have a good time. And people would say things like, the system works. We're not going to get a toxic waste incinerator now, because we came together in the community, we decided there was a problem, we found a lawyer who could speak, we found a judge that said the right things, he threw the permit out, and now we're not going to get the toxic waste incinerator in our community. Right? So what would happen 30 or 60 days later? Well, the corporation would come back. And this time they'd have a new and improved permit application, right? And as I told the group earlier today, I had lawyers for the Waste Management Corporation, who was one of our foes in a bunch of these, actually thanked me for finding the gaps, omissions, and deficiencies, because then they could bill more hours to the corporation to correct the permit applications before they became effective through the system. And so they would come back, and then the community group would come back to us, and they'd say, Mr. Linzey, we need you to do that jujitsu again that you did the first time around to get this permit out, because we don't want the toxic waste incinerator. And we'd end up saying to them, we're sorry, there's nothing that we can do for you at this point, because all of our levers are gone. All the stuff is gone that we would normally use to try to slow down or stop the permit and stuff like that. What was fascinating, as I'm compressing on this down, because some of these community groups fight for 15, 20 years. It's a cycle. You know, they'll come back, they make the challenge, the corporation replaces something, they're back again, they make the challenge. Eventually they lose, because the system is set up for them to lose. The system is set up for them to lose, because The regulations that we're enforcing, of course, were written by the very corporations that ostensibly the regulations are supposed to regulate. And if we think that the corporations who wrote the regulatory schemes are actually going to build any power whatsoever into it for our communities to actually say no to their stuff coming into our communities, that's crazy. That's insane. Right? For them to have the script, they write the script, and we follow the script. To think that script gives us any control whatsoever within our communities to actually say no to the thing coming in that's harming us. That's nuts, right? But that insanity has been what has informed our environmental activism for the past 40 years in this country. There should be no surprise after 40 years after the major environmental laws were passed in the United States that things are worse now by almost every major environmental statistic than they were 40 years ago. It should come as no surprise. We've been operating under somebody else's rules. And those rules have been written to guarantee extraction. They've been written to guarantee factory farms. They've been written to guarantee the stuff that we've been trying to stop. What was fascinating to me and somewhat depressing during this period of time is that we ran up this great win-loss record. It was like 120-5, right? Because we would win in front of the administrative law judges and the courts. We would win when we found the gaps, omissions, and deficiencies, right? But if you actually set foot in the communities that we were assisting, you saw absolutely no similarities between the win-loss record that we had posted and the actual communities themselves, which were getting the toxic waste incineration in the factory farms and the sludge. We weren't stopping shit, right? Because environmental law isn't about stopping anything, right? It's in essence about enforcing the corporation's own regulations against them, right? I mean, that's the conclusion we came to. And so at that point in time, somebody named Jane Ann Morris, who we had a symposium earlier today, and we went through one of her pieces, and she said something to me that stuck with me for years, which was, she said the only things that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists. The only thing that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists, because they make us predictable as to how we fight. It makes us predictable as to how we oppose projects. Not only do they know we're coming, they've scripted out the rules as to how we're coming, right? Yeah. They know it. And they have the base prepared to actually fight it. And not only the base prepared to fight it, but we used to think that we were at least costing the corporations money. You know, because they were hiring the $1,200, $1,500 lawyers to come in, that had to come in when we did the permit appeals stuff in front of the judges. And it turns out all the monies that the corporations spend on those permit defenses is tax deductible under the law, as a reasonable and necessary business expense under the tax code. It's tax deductible. When I first heard that, I wanted to vomit all over everything, right? Because you just start seeing people have faith that there's some kind of system operating that's protecting the environment, protecting their communities. There ain't nothing there. And in fact, the store's been turned over to the boys who have the opposite interest, which is actually about sucking shit out. Sucking shit out of your communities, right? That's the deal. But we've been our activism has been so stupid over the past 40 years, it's really been incredible. I mean, without the hand-to-hand stuff that we've been doing, things would be worse. Maybe not about it. But at the same time, we're now in worse shape than we were 40 years ago, doing the same kind of activism. So the question is, when are we going to get our heads out of our ass and actually do something different? So we decided to shut down the legal defense fund. That's what we did. For our part, we decided that we were going to go home and stop building better permit applications. Because that's what we were doing. We were helping corporations build better permit applications. We decided we're not going to do that anymore. It was about that time that the phone calls into our office started to shift. And they started to shift because in South Central Pennsylvania, where we were doing a lot of work at that time, there was a huge influx of factory farm corporations that wanted to set up shop. At one point, there were 350 new factory farm operations that were targeted for South Central Pennsylvania. So these are the large hog confinement operations, concentrated animal feeding operations, as they're known in the biz, CAFOs. They were targeting South Central Pennsylvania for these operations because they were being driven out of North Carolina and South Carolina. I don't know whether people remember in the late 1990s, you turn on the nightly news, there was a hurricane that came through North Carolina and South Carolina, uncapped all the manure lagoons from the various the concentrated animal feeding operations. You saw the dead hogs going down the rivers off the coast, creating a dead zone off the coast of South Carolina and North Carolina. The legislatures there put a temporary moratorium in place on any new factory farms. So the factory farm corporations needed a place to go, and so they began moving north. And they targeted this area in central Pennsylvania to stick all these operations in. The communities in south central Pennsylvania, these small townships, they're called townships in Pennsylvania, sub-county, that some are as small as 100 people or 400 people or 600 people, that they had for a number of years to keep factory farms out, had passed a series of manure management laws that made it prohibitively expensive to dispose of liquid hog manure. Sorry, it's a great topic. But liquid hog manure is very heavy. It's very heavy. And it costs a lot to dispose of it. What these communities did was made it prohibitively expensive. It was almost like a de facto ban on new factory farms by making it too expensive to dispose of liquid manure. The agribusiness corporations came into south central Pennsylvania, ran into those laws that actually prohibited them, cost-wise, from setting up shop in those communities. What did the agribusiness corporations do? Well, they went to the Pennsylvania legislature, and they drafted a bill called the Nutrient Management Act. And what did the Nutrient Management Act do? Well, it said if you wanted to put in a factory farm, all you had to do was file a plan with the state to tell them how you were going to dispose of your liquid manure, and to show them that you were disposing of it correctly. If you did so, if you filed this nutrient management plan, which is what it was called, then you were exempt from all local laws dealing with factory farm operations. In one swoop, it was actually about 2 in the morning when the legislature did this, when the Pennsylvania legislature does their best work, is at 2 in the morning. They inserted this preemption clause in there, which overnight nullified all 500 of the ordinances in south central Pennsylvania that were keeping the factory farms out. So the phone calls to the office started to change. I think it was partly because people were watching the raw power of the agribusiness corporations come in to clean them out. But something was in the air at that point. I think something was starting to shift. And so the calls that came in that were usually Groundhog Day oriented, i.e. we have a new factory farm coming in and we want to say no to it. And we would say back to them, well, you can't say no because you'll get sued and the corporation can hold you liable for damage and you can go bankrupt and all these things. That instead of going along with us, people started fighting us. And I think that's when things changed. Because I would say, well, you can't do that because corporations have constitutional rights and they'll sue you. And corporations have these rights and they can do that. And the person on the other end of the phone would say, why? And we'd say, well, corporations have rights in the United States. They have the rights of persons. The U.S. Supreme Court has given them those rights over the years, mostly in the 1800s. And corporations have these personhood rights. And the person on the other phone would say, why? And we'd say, well, it was pretty easy for corporations to get those rights because the U.S. Constitution in some ways is written to put property and commerce over the rights of people, communities, and nature. It's like a structural thing in the U.S. Constitution. And because of that, it's easy for corporations to crawl into that because corporations are economic actors in property and commerce issues. And they would say, why? Why is the Constitution written that way? And we'd say, well, it's because the U.S. Constitution was borrowed from something called English common law. And English common law is the stuff that arose when the big powers, like the Dutch and the English, and the French to some extent, the Portuguese, were all colonizing other places, where they plant their flag and pretend that nobody lived there and then take over the Caribbean, India, and other places. And they invented this thing called English common law, which legalized all the violence. It legalized, like, the doctrine of discovery, which is if you landed on it, it was yours. As long as you were white and Anglo-Saxon in some circumstances, it was yours. And so all that English common law stuff was really nasty shit. I mean, it was bad stuff. But our lawyers, when they wrote the U.S. Constitution, that's all they knew. So they took English common law stuff, they jammed it into the U.S. Constitution stuff. And that's why we have the system that we have. And the people on the other end of the phone say, why? And we'd say, we have no idea, but maybe we'll help you find that out as we go down this path. And these communities started saying to us, we would say, well, you get sued. And they would say, we don't care. Because sometimes getting sued is better than the other alternative, which is to accept the factory farms into the communities, which is what they were faced with. And so some folks began to choose a different direction, and some of those communities retained us. And they came to us and they said, we want you to find a way to keep these things out. And we said, we have no idea how to do that. We don't know shit about agriculture, and so we had a learning curve there. It turns out, starting in 1904, believe it or not, in the United States, 8 states across the United States have passed things called anti-corporate farming laws that ban corporations from engaging in farming activities within those states. To make it even more amazing, states like South Dakota and Nebraska, unhappy with just moving the laws as statutes, normal laws, actually took the anti-corporate farming laws and embedded them into their state constitutions. So in South Dakota it was Amendment E, in Nebraska it was Initiative 300, but they actually took this anti-corporate farming stuff and jammed it into their state constitutions, right? It told us something very important, which was that some folks somewhere, sometime, mostly in South Dakota and Nebraska, because those are the most recent ones, said to themselves, well, the problem from factory farms is not air pollution or water pollution. It's not, those are just the symptoms of the factory farm stuff, the concentrated animal feeding operation stuff. But the real problem is corporations in agriculture, which have corporatized agriculture. Today in the United States, 4 corporations control close to 80% of all pork processing in the United States. 4 corporations. 5 corporations control 70% of all chicken processing in the United States today. 1 corporation today controls 60% of all cheese production. Does anybody know who that is? Kraft. Kraft's company. This corporatization of agriculture that's occurred, we've lost 300,000 farmers over the past 7 years in this country. And whenever people talk about it, they always say we lost them, like we can't find them. We just don't know where they are. But they've been driven out of business. It's the physical reality of the farming and agricultural industry today, is that this corporatization of agriculture has harnessed people and farmers into being contract operators with the largest corporations that operate in the world today. And under these arrangements called output contracts, the corporation contracts with you, the farmer. You agree to raise the livestock for the corporation, but you don't even have title to the animals anymore. Title for the animals is held by the corporation unless the animal dies. And then title reverts back to the farmer, back to dispose of the animal. Vaccination schedules, feeding schedules, you name it, all controlled by the corporate contractor. In addition, that the corporation gives all environmental liability to the farmer. So the farmer holds environmental liability on his shoulders as well. It's all about externalizing the damages and externalizing the harms from these major corporations. And so some farmers have now been harnessed through these output contracts to put other farmers out of business. That's in essence how it's worked. Suicide among farmers is now the #1 cause of non-natural death in the United States for farmers in this country. And so it's not just about changing production methods. It's actually about vacuuming out a culture, destroying a culture of generations-old farms. So that was kind of the situation we were in South Central Pennsylvania. We found those anti-corporate farm laws because it said to us someone had defined the problem differently. Not just as parts per million, odor pollution, water pollution, whatever, but that the problem itself was the corporatization of agriculture. And the answer to the corporatization of agriculture is to get corporations out of agriculture, right? And that's where the anti-corporate farming laws came from. Through no private authorship, we stole the South Dakota version. We took it, we cut and pasted it, we stuck it into a local law, and we sent it out to all these township governments in South Central Pennsylvania who were, asking us to do something, find a new way to deal with these issues. And lo and behold, a little place, this all started in this tiny little place called Wells Township in Fulton County, Pennsylvania. It's up against the Maryland line. It is 650 people big. That's where this whole thing, that we're talking about tonight started. In this one little place with one elected official and a community organization that was working with them. That's where it happened first. They became the first in the United States to adopt a local ordinance that banned corporations from farming within the township. The agribusiness corporations, happened to be Smithfield Foods Corporation, which is one of the big agribusiness operators, took a look at the ordinance and said, wow, we don't want to get tangled up and spend $50,000, $100,000, even though it's tax deductible, in a dispute with this little township, because we have 3,000 other municipalities that we can put factory farms into. So we're not going to tangle with this little place. And they pulled out of Wells Township. So Wells passed the law banning corporations. Corporations pulled out, went someplace else. The ordinance started to travel. These local laws started to travel. First within Fulton County, pretty soon half the townships had passed it. Then it went up to north central PA, and then it spread out on the wings in Pennsylvania. So pretty soon we had about a dozen, a little bit more than that, municipalities who passed the anti-corporate farm laws. There was no worry to the agribusiness boys. There's not a lot of places to go, and we weren't particularly worried about it. But then the sewage sludge folks started calling us. And in the United States today, also not a popular topic, but sewage sludge in the United States is everything that's produced by sewage treatment plants that are hooked up to centralized sewage treatment systems. So everything you put down the toilet, down the sink, along with hospital waste, some other nasty waste coming out of other places, actually all goes into the waste stream. At the sewage treatment plant separates out the solid from the liquid, and the liquid is discharged into a tributary usually. So a stream or river, they pretend it's clean, they discharge it out. The solid stuff is then called sludge cake, which goes to show you can't do cake after everything, make it sound that much better. But sludge cake, we used to haul and dump off the coast of New Jersey. So we used to do it. So, off the coast of New Jersey, guess what happened? A dead zone emerges off the coast of New Jersey, because that's what happens when you dump shit off the coast with toxins in it, right? What's in the waste stream can contain up to 300,000 different toxic contaminants. How much does EPA require testing for? 12. There's those 300,000 contaminants that come through. The environmental organizations, not to name names, but NRDC, partnered with the waste industry and the EPA to come up with a new plan for waste disposal. And that new plan for waste disposal was actually developed to allow for the land application of sewage sludge. Today, 60% of all sludge produced by sewage treatment plants, that solid stuff, is actually hauled away by private corporate operators to be dumped on farmland where we grow our crops. So crops for livestock feed as well as for human consumption. In the United States, you have a plethora of different illnesses, injuries, and deaths. We've had 2 kids, documented deaths, one in Pennsylvania, one in New Hampshire, from exposure to pathogens contained within the sludge that's been applied to the fields. One of the most cheapest, we're a little off topic, one of the cheapest methods of treatment is lime stabilization. So let's pretend for a moment that you can actually do it, but it's about the smaller treatment systems dumping bags of lime into the sludge, mixing it. I've seen them mix it with canoe paddles. And then pretend that the lime has actually changed the pH of every particle within the waste load to actually make it safe for land application. Once it goes out for land application, it gets spread, and then it dries, and then it becomes airborne. The lime particles actually combine with other things to become airborne. The kids breathed it in, were in the hospital 24 hours later, and 72 hours later they were dead. And so it's nasty stuff. That's how we dispose of it. In Pennsylvania, people became not quite happy that Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, these rich suburban areas, who weren't going to dump sludge in their own neighborhoods next to their multi-million-dollar McMansions, were shipping it into central Pennsylvania. So they were literally shitting on rural Pennsylvania. And some people in rural Pennsylvania weren't very happy with that. They called us and said, hey, we've heard what you're doing with these anti-corporate farming ordinances. We want you to replicate those for the sludge stuff, because 60% of all sludge dumped in the United States is dumped by 4 corporations. So 4 corporations have the biggest share of that sludge dumping. And they make money because they're paid with your money, taxpayer money, to haul it from the municipal authority. And the farmer takes it in the back end for free because they've become convinced it's a replacement for chemical fertilizer. They don't have to pay for the chemical fertilizer. And so that's how the money train runs in terms of public subsidies. And just to let you know how small the world is, Synagro was the largest hauler of waste management. And Synagro was recently bought out by one of the companies that was involved in the spy and drone stuff. And also involved in Iraqi with the private troops. So anyway, it's a small world. So then all these are all embedded with each other. So these communities called us up and they said, we want your help. We want to try to replicate this stuff that you've been doing in South Central Pennsylvania. We had no idea what we were doing. We were just trying to do what we could at the moment to find the tools to help the communities that we needed to help. And so we took the anti-corporate farming law and we made it into an anti-corporate sludging law, which banned corporations from sludging within those municipalities. It went like hotcakes. There were so many more people affected by sludge than factory farms. Pretty soon it was 10, then 20, then 50, then 60. We were up to 84 municipalities in Pennsylvania. Combined with the factory farm ordinances, we were at 10% of all rural municipalities in the state that had now passed these ordinances to say no to factory farms or to sludge. It was then that things started getting really interesting, which was when the corporate boys start to move, they tend to move in they have different strategies. One strategy, of course, is to sue, because in the hopes is that if you sue a municipality, that it will chill the activity of others so that you will stop it. The other one is to go to the state legislature and get it preempted out. So you go to the state legislature, you talk to legislators, and try to get a bill that preempts it, because then you can knock it all out all at once. The first thing the agribusiness corporations did in PA was to sue one of the local municipalities that had passed the anti-corporate farming law. Now, for 2 years, because we may not have known what we were doing at the time, but we also knew that this stuff ran frontally up against corporate rights, or claimed corporate rights in this country, that we would talk to audiences of elected officials and others, and we would tell them, you can pass these ordinances, but you have to be alert that corporations can come in and sue you over these ordinances. They can still contend that these violate their corporate constitutional rights. And by and large, we would be at that point talking to a group of people whose eyes had just glazed over completely. Because the elected officials would say things like, corporate constitutional rights? What the hell is that? That may be something you learned in grade school or law school probably, or college or whatever, but don't bother us with that here. We live in a democracy. And that means we've exercised our lawmaking authority here. We're enforcing our laws, and that's what a democracy is about. We live in a democracy. Don't bother us with that corporate rights stuff. We don't want to hear it. We don't understand it. Go do whatever else you do. Thank you for helping us, blah, blah, blah. Well, knock at the door at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon in one of these small municipalities that passed the anti-corporate farming laws that they had in place. And it was a lawsuit. It was the sheriff serving the lawsuit. And the lawsuit on page 1 said, we are agribusiness corporations. We are persons under the law. And your anti-corporate farming law violates our corporate constitutional rights. Okay? Specifically, they were alleging that the 14th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, which says that everybody's entitled to equal protection, all persons are entitled to equal protection under the law, had been violated because the municipality had banned corporate farmers, which were persons under the law, as well as supporting family farmers, which were persons under the law. And so the legal argument was, you can't treat persons differently because we're all persons under the law. And when you discriminate against corporate farmers on behalf and in favor of individual farmers, then you're acting unconstitutionally because you're violating our corporate 14th Amendment equal protection rights. Okay? Just ponder that for a moment. And if our governments act to actually preference family farmers, sustainable stuff, over unsustainable corporate farmers, that we are acting unconstitutionally. Because our Constitution doesn't allow, because corporations have constitutional rights. Kind of blows your brain. Anyway, when the folks answered the door and they had the complaint handed to them and they read page 1, I got a phone call. And they said, now we understand. Right? Now we understand how this corporate rights stuff actually works, how it functions. That complaint, I mean, this was before the internet really went whiz-bang, but that complaint got faxed all over the state of Pennsylvania, right? The municipal officials were enraged because they thought we lived in a democracy. And so they faxed this thing all over the place. We ran into it in north central and northwestern Pennsylvania, everywhere we go. It became a topic of conversation because the activism work had been done differently. In other words, the conversation was about corporations and farming. That it had started a different kind of conversation. If the community had continued to try to pass water pollution laws or parts per million laws on, we had one community want to pass a fly control ordinance, okay? If we had stuck with that kind of traditional conventional activism, there would have been no conversation really that we had. We pass those things all the time. Corporations come in and they crank it down, and then we go on our merry way and try to do it all over again because we're pretty much stupid in that arena. But because it changed, and it became relevant to talk about corporations and power and who had the power and who had more rights than who, that this fax thing all over the state became hotcakes. I mean, it became a very hot thing. Next thing I know, I'm in front of a group of elected officials just north of Pittsburgh, and I'm going over the stuff that happened with this particular ordinance and the lawsuit and all that kind of stuff. And I had one of the chairmen of the township supervisors stand up, and he said, well, Mr. Linzey, you've said to us, and now it's been proven that corporations have these rights that are used to overturn whatever we do here. And I said, yeah. And he said, then what's the point? And I said, well, that's a good question. And he said, shouldn't we be working on an ordinance that actually eliminates corporate rights within our communities? And I said, you can't do that. Because that violates, the U.S. Supreme Court, the federal government, and everything else. And he said, well, we want you to draft an ordinance that strips corporations of constitutional powers within our township. And again, we said, you can't do that. You know, we were the first ones to say you couldn't. You can't. And I said, why do you want to do something like that? And he said, well, we need to protect the ordinance that we have in place. We need to actually protect it from this type of aggression, this type of overturning. And I said, well, you realize that you're just running right into the maw of the corporate rights stuff. And you're acting legally and unconstitutionally and everything else. And he said, we know. But we don't have an option at this point. Right? And he said, we think that if we do it, maybe somebody else does it. And if somebody else does it, maybe somebody else does the same thing. And maybe you have 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 start to do it. And eventually at some point it begins to actually make change on a structural level. Right? And basically that conversation that we had with Mick Robertson, who ended up on the cover of Mother Jones magazine for what his township actually did, that conversation was actually the predictor for where we headed for the next 15 or 20 years. Which was essentially that we live in a system that you have to change structurally. Because structurally, we're fucked. I mean, you know, because if you respect those rights, if you respect that body of law, we're cooked, because we can't do anything. Because our communities aren't even recognized as actual communities with any lawmaking authority whatsoever, or any powers of local self-government. And so, you know, I said to Mick, well, if you guys want to put your municipality on the line for this, that will help draft something up. And so we drafted something called the Corporate Rights Elimination Ordinance for their municipality. And we sent it out there. Part of it was a dare, because we didn't think anybody would adopt it. Right? And so it appears on the agenda for a municipality in north of Pittsburgh, a little place called Licking Township. And I drove the car up there just to sit in the thing while this thing was considered, because I was nervous for the world. In that part of Pennsylvania, the municipal governments are so poor that they don't have their own offices. They meet in the salt sheds where they store the salt to actually put it on the roads during the wintertime. You know? So you go in, they're folding chairs around the salt stack, and there's a light bulb, naked light bulb hanging down. It's like a bad horror movie, swinging back and forth. And that night, people came in to testify on the ordinance, because you have to have a public hearing before you adopt it. You had farmers coming in with copies of the Pennsylvania Constitution tucked into their back pockets that they had downloaded from the internet. Article 1, Section 1 of the Pennsylvania Constitution says, people are the source of all governing authority. That's what Article 1, Section 1 says. Guess what? It's in all of our constitutions, right? Same kind of stuff as in the New Mexico Constitution. People are the source of all governing authority, right? So people are asking the question, how is it that corporations and this small number of directors who live 3,000 miles away from here, how is it possible that they have more rights than we do within this community, right? And somebody else brought Tom Paine's Common Sense in. You know, you're in the most rural area of Pennsylvania, you know, 100 miles from Pittsburgh, you know. And people are having a conversation I couldn't even have with my own peers, my own colleagues, about what some of this stuff meant. And people were taking it seriously, and they were actually venting serious stuff and bringing historical documents and all kinds of things into this conversation. And that night, that little township became the first in the United States to pass a local law that strips corporations of constitutional rights within the municipality. And then that started to travel, because people started to learn about that, about them passing it. Pretty soon, a neighboring municipality had passed it as well. And then it started to travel into other counties across the state of Pennsylvania. The agribusiness corporation started to get really upset. The agribusiness sludge corporation started to get really upset, and they went to the legislature. And they drafted a bill for the legislature. They're so helpful in that respect, you know, drafting their own bills and getting it to the legislature. It's very helpful. In those bills, it made it illegal to actually pass any of these ordinances. And it required the assessment of attorney's fees from the municipality that had passed the ordinance to be paid to the corporations that were affected by the ordinance itself. Right? We fought for 6 years to stop that legislation from becoming law, built coalitions and all the good stuff that we do, you know, lefty progressive stuff to try to stop that stuff from going forward. Eventually we got a liberal Democratic governor, Ed Rendell. People said, oh, he's a liberal Democrat, he's never going to do anything to sell municipalities down the river. Sure enough, 60 days after he got into office, there's Ed Rendell writing a new version of a new bill, which was even worse than the first bill that was written by the agribusiness corporations. That was eventually passed. What does it say? It gives the Attorney General's office the authority to sue municipal governments to overturn ordinances that have been adopted by those municipalities. Okay? So, just to stop, because we've been going pretty quick here, but if you're an agribusiness corporation, right, Smithfield Foods or Chesapeake Foods or one of the other companies, or a fracking company now, because the law also applies to them. If you come into a municipality and find an ordinance, right, that is defined under this state statute being illegal, which is essentially anything dealing with local control over agriculture and a couple other issues, you can, instead of, prior to this law, you had to hire a lawyer, go in, sue the municipality, get them to the courts, then get a ruling. Now they pick up the phone. They pick up the phone and they call the Attorney General's office. And the Attorney General appoints a lawyer from the office to the case. And then the lawyer from the office drives down to the municipality and threatens the municipal officials that if they don't repeal the law, that the state is going to sue them. Not the corporation is going to sue them, but the state of Pennsylvania is going to sue them using their own taxpayer dollars to do so. Right? So, people say, well, that's really bad, right? What's happening in Pennsylvania, because now you have the state doing this, and the Attorney General can come in and do this, and all kinds of other stuff can start. And our general feeling was, this was great. This was a great development. Because up until that point, people wanted to talk about the corporations being the enemy. But the corporation's not the enemy. I mean, there may be one. But the corporations are enabled to do what they do by our own government. Right? They're chartered by our own governments. They're given permits by our own governments. Right? The corporations couldn't do what they do without the government. Right? But people didn't want to hear that either. Their eyes glazed over. They said, well, no, it's the corporation. They're coming in next week to frack. And they're the problem. It's the corporation that's the problem. Nobody wanted to hear that it was the structure of government that we have. That's actually the government system that we have. That's the problem. But man, you get the Assistant Attorney General bringing his Chrysler into your municipality and giving your elected officials at the local level a lecture that if they do not repeal what they've adopted, that they're going to be sued. That opens your eyes really, really quickly. And it happened in Pennsylvania, the starkest place it happened, a little place called East Brunswick, above Philadelphia on the other side of the state. The Assistant Attorney General came in and told people that if they didn't repeal their ordinance banning sewage sludge from being dumped in the municipality, that the state was going to sue them. To which the ladies, the women, who comprised the community group who forced the local officials to adopt the ordinance in the first place, took him by the arms and led him physically out of the meeting, saying, thank you for coming, but we've got everything handled here because we don't have sludge and we passed this ordinance banning sludge, so have a good time on your way back to the Capitol in Harrisburg. Right? Harrisburg Capital newspaper, front page photograph. There was somebody from the Associated Press at that meeting, and they captured the photo of the guy being led out by the women from the citizens group, chucking him out of the municipal building that he was in. Right? The next day, the Attorney General filed suit against East Brunswick. Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus East Brunswick Township. Right? That was the caption. The state itself, right? What happened next? Well, the municipality next door, a little place called Packard Township, then passed an ordinance that suspended the jurisdiction of the Attorney General for enforcing anti-competitive laws. Right? And so the fire just started to build, but none of this would have happened. None of it would have happened, except for people set out on a new course of activism. They dropped the old stuff, and they actually moved in a much more fundamental, straightforward, straight-line kind of direction. Today, Pennsylvania is pretty much on fire. There's like an armed stand-down between the sides because the Attorney General's office hasn't brought a new suit in a while because they've read the tea leaves as well. And now Pennsylvania, communities are stitching themselves together just last year and actually began seriously to do work as the Pennsylvania Community Rights Network. There are now 160 communities in 9 states that have done some of what these communities in Pennsylvania have done. So very similar tools. Moore County is like the limousine vehicle because they came later and were able to use the expertise of all the others that came before them. What do these ordinances do? Well, they've become local Bill of Rights ordinances. Sometimes it's hard to get our brains around that. We're used to the federal government having a Bill of Rights and the state government and the state constitution having a Bill of Rights. We're not used to thinking about our municipalities as having bills of rights. But what's happening now is a rights movement across the United States, which communities are not just prohibiting stuff, like fracking or factory farms or whatever the harm is, but actually asserting a new structure of rights. Right to clean water, right to clean air, right to a sustainable energy future, right structure that automatically prohibits in many ways the activities that are being harmful to the community. And then these communities are insulating those prohibitions and bills of rights from corporate challenge by actually divesting corporations that violate the ordinance of certain rights and powers within the municipality. They're also doing something else quite extraordinary, which is recognizing the rights of ecosystems. In the United States, as well as all other industrialized countries for the last 5,000 years, except in indigenous communities, nature has been treated as property. So ecosystems are property under our system of law. They can be owned, and consequently, they can be destroyed. The more property you're able to own under our system of law, because nature is property, treated as property, the more ecosystems you can destroy under the system of law. That's how our process system works. Indigenous communities have always had a different understanding of nature. Not as something that could be owned and destroyed for private use, but actually as something much different than that. I think the white communities are beginning to actually pick up that indigenous stuff and driving it into these structures of law by recognizing that ecosystems and natural communities actually have independent rights to exist and flourish within the community. That they're no longer property, they're actually something different. And in so doing, they're following in the footsteps, I think, of the abolitionists and the suffragists and other prior people's movements in the United States, which actually were all about taking property and converting property into persons under the law. In the 1840s, and of course since the drafting of the Constitution, women were not persons in the United States. Women were property. There was no such thing as rape as a crime in the United States in the 1840s. It was a property damage crime. You paid damages to the husband. For, as crass as it sounds, loss of use. That's how the courts saw it. So it was property damage crime. In the 1840s, 1850s, of course, African Americans were not persons. They were property. So there was no such thing as homicide of a slave. You couldn't murder a slave. If you did murder a slave or kill a slave, you paid property damages to the slave owner. Right? So under our system of law, you're either property or you're a property. You're either rights-bearing or you're property. Under our system of law, under environmental standards at least, things are worse now than they were 40 years ago. Something's wrong with the way that we're doing our activism. And so some communities, including Mora, have now begun to recognize that ecosystems have rights of their own. And that's also tough to bend our brain around, I think, in some ways. Because of what happened in the United States, the Ecuadorian Constitutional Assembly contacted us to come back. In 2007, the Ecuadorians were writing a new constitution. And they had heard about the rights of nature work that was done in the United States, and they called us down to help them think this stuff through. We went down and helped them draft language that could be inserted into the Ecuadorian Constitution that recognizes that Pachamama, or nature, Mother Earth, actually has independently enforceable legal rights. That got inserted into the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008. They ratified the Constitution overwhelmingly. So the popular initiative, referendum process, they ratified the Constitution overwhelmingly. The next thing that happened was a couple of case studies. In other words, a couple of test cases. And those were fascinating. The first one that was brought by a river in Ecuador against the local government that was interfering with the course of the river through construction activities that were happening on the bank. The river was a plaintiff because under these laws, it's not people that are the plaintiffs anymore. It's actually the ecosystem. So the caption was the Vilcabamba River versus the province of Loja. So it was actually about vindicating the rights of the river, not our right to use the river, which is how most environmental laws are written. They're about our exploitation, our right to exploit resources or nature. These are about nature itself as a independent entity with rights of its own. The judge ruled in favor of the Vilcabamba River. It actually stopped the roads construction project and ordered remediation. There's been other test cases as well in Ecuador. I think that's where some of the most exciting stuff is happening right now are rights of nature. The reason for our trip to Australia and New Zealand was actually to talk to them about rights of nature and beginning to move it at the local level. You now have a rights of nature organization existing within Australia that's been set up just to do that. In Nepal, they're beginning to write a new constitution as well. They're talking about actually putting rights of nature material into that new constitution. It's fascinating. If you get a chance to travel in that part of the world, the Himalayas are melting. You know, so the guides who came to the meetings and testified, they find black rock now, where the glacier and ice sheets used to be. So all that's melting. The problem for Nepal is that all their farming is located underneath the Himalayas, which are delivering the water source down to the crops. And so eventually they're looking at a national catastrophe as well. So it's a global thing that's happening across the world, in which people are facing up against a structure of law that seems to be unable to stop us from killing ourselves. Because that's in essence what it is. Our institutions and laws are not set up to actually allow for our survival. They're allowed for something else. So the last thing tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to these guys for Q&A about what's happening here, is the fact that, you know, people have this hero worship about the U.S. Constitution in this country. It's like a sacred cow. And I think some of that has begun to unwind over the past couple of years. In fact, one of the retired Supreme Court justices was asked recently, she said, a reporter asked her, she said, if you had to write a new constitution for a new country, what template model would you use? And she said, well, I certainly wouldn't use the United States. You know, because it's an anti-democratic document. And in the democracy schools that we teach, we actually talk about how undemocratic it is. But the U.S., when people extol the U.S. Constitution, they're usually extolling the Bill of Rights. You know, free speech and the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure, and all that kind of stuff. We forget, however, that the Bill of Rights had to be driven in over the opposition of the people that actually wrote the Constitution. They didn't want the Bill of Rights there. Structurally, how they built the U.S. Constitution was this. We had a U.S. Senate for 120 years that was not popularly elected. In other words, it was appointed by the state legislatures. And the state legislatures were only elected by white males with property, who had property privilege to actually participate in civil and political affairs. So even though our state legislators in the United States were popularly elected, you could only participate in the election system if you were a white male with property qualifications. In addition, the president, you know, some would say most powerful figure within the government, the president was not popularly elected either. He was elected by an electoral college, which, in other words, he was appointed by an electoral college. And guess what? The president today still is not popularly elected. We appoint him through the electoral college process. In addition to that, our U.S. Constitution contains a commerce clause. The commerce clause actually prohibits states or municipalities from interfering with interstate commerce. So when you pass a fracking ban, for example, one way it can be attacked is that you're interfering with interstate commerce, because energy production has been deemed to be interstate commerce. So you open yourself up to a corporate lawsuit from that end as well. It turns out the founders didn't exactly trust democracy. And they wrote a document that reflects that. In fact, James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, once said that the goal of the constitutional structure was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Okay? Those are quotes right from James Madison. So in terms of getting our heads out of our asses, we actually have to think about the U.S. Constitution, when it was written, who it protected, what the mindset was at the time. I mean, in the 18th century, the founders looked out and saw an infinite bounty of natural resources across the landscape of the United States. And they said to themselves, well, for us to become as powerful and prosperous as the European countries, we have to exploit those natural resources, because that's what progress is. You take the natural resources, extract them, and you use them, put them in a usable product. And so they wrote a constitutional structure that actually accelerated and expedited that resource extraction and use. It wasn't their fault. It's just that that's the way that they thought. I mean, that was the mindset. At the time the Constitution was written, it only protected 0.1% of all the folks walking on two legs in the United States. 0.1%. Because it only protected the white males with property, didn't protect women, didn't protect African Americans, didn't protect Native Americans, didn't protect indigenous communities, didn't protect any of those things. And so we really have to start to question exactly what the U.S. Constitution is, how it serves us today or doesn't, and whether we need to mow parts of it down and actually rewrite parts of it, which I think is where we're headed. So, final thought for tonight, where's all this headed? There is a community rights movement that wants to be born in the United States. We don't think it's there yet. It's basically disparate communities in different places who are trying to wrangle with a system of law that gives corporations more rights than their communities. And they're trying to wrangle with that in a structural way. That movement is most easily seen through the 160 communities in the United States that have passed local laws. Mora is one of them. The city of Las Vegas is another in New Mexico. Those 160 communities are now binding themselves together into state organizations. So you have a Pennsylvania Community Rights Network, a Colorado Community Rights Network, an Oregon Community Rights Network. And those state community rights networks are now working on constitutional and legislative change at the state level, with an understanding that stuff that is now popped up in those 160 communities has to be driven upwards. It actually has to change the structural stuff at the state level, and eventually joining with other states to change the federal structural stuff. Because a lot of this means that we're in a long ride towards changing the very structure that controls what we can and can't do at the local level. Currently today, the constitutional structure recognizes the federal government and states. It does not recognize you. It does not recognize your communities or municipalities. If tomorrow the state of New Mexico wanted to get rid of the city of Santa Fe as a municipal corporation, there's no legal reason why it can't. There's no legal reason why it couldn't. It may not be politically feasible, but they can get rid of you in a swipe because you have no right to local self-government under the law. That may sound crazy, but that's the status of where we sit today. All in all, we were talking over dinner about how hopeless everything was, or seems to be, because things keep getting worse. We've got the NSA stuff, and now we're spying on Angela's cell phone, and all this other stuff happening and going on. Seems like the world is kind of spun out of control. And people are looking at each other saying, what can we do? And a lot of people are just feeling hopeless and helpless. This work is about not feeling helpless anymore. This work is about not turning to state legislators anymore to save us. It's not about begging and pleading state agencies to do something. It's not about writing letters to Congress. It's not about pressure politics. It's not about buying Priuses. It's not about changing light bulbs. It's actually about gutting the system that is and building a new one. And actually that new vision coming into place through these local lawmaking vehicles that are starting to surface in these various municipalities. It's very exciting work. Here in New Mexico, it's being led by the New Mexico Coalition for Community Rights, NMCCR, and those are the folks beginning to put other people together to make this statewide drive, but also to assist more and more communities to pass these local ordinance vehicles. And I think it's very exciting work, and I'm happy to be here tonight. Thank you.